Welcome, everyone, to the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm Glenda Rose, President of Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, here with State Archaeologist Dr. Sarah Sportman and our special guest. During today's program, we will discuss perspectives on the intersection of archaeology and folklore, for example, what the two disciplines can learn from each other. For me, this topic brings to mind the story of the city of Z and the obsessive and fatal search for it by Percy Fawcett in the Amazon during the 1920s. But we have many local sites here in Connecticut that have lore attached, such as Gunjewamp, Lover's Leap, and Devil's Hopyard, to name a few. So during today's show, we will be talking about historical places and people that have stories attached, where those stories came from, and whether they are true or rooted in truth. Now here's Sarah to introduce our guest and get the conversation started.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our October episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. As Glenda said, we thought it would be fun this month to take a look at archaeology, myth, and folklore. So we invited folklorist and fellow iCRV host, Dr. Gencarella, to join us for the show.
Hey, good to see you all. And I was pounding on the door to get in because I have been dying to get on the show and to finally interact with all of you. So thank you so much for this warm welcome. I'm so delighted to be here.
We're excited to have you, and we're excited to have this conversation. Glenda's touched on some of the things we wanted to cover, but maybe before we get started, I know you're familiar to many of the iCRV listeners, but maybe some of the Archaeology of Connecticut folks aren't familiar with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I am a professor of folklore studies at the University of Massachusetts. I am a born and bred New Englander, and outside of my PhD at Indiana University for 6 years, I've lived basically in southern New England. Most of my research is on the folklore and cultural heritage of New England. I will tell you that my first desire when I was a kid was to be an archaeologist, and I still have the letter that I wrote to an archaeologist at the University of Rhode Island, and he wrote back, and so it didn't turn out that way, but I went to something I think similar and adjacent and engaging. So that's who I am in a nutshell. And I had the pleasure of teaching several classes on folklore up at UMass, and I'm just absolutely delighted to be here. But let me thank both of you, right? Again, especially the Friends of Archaeology. I mean, again, it's such a pivotal. I mean, in any public interaction of the public with science and with representations of the past. I mean, it's just essential that we have a strong friends group. And so, again, I can't tell you from the bottom of my heart how grateful I am for all the work that all of you have done and historically have done to support the good work here. And again, Sarah, again, it is a true honor to be in a room with you and to sit with somebody who, has done such great and will continue to do important work, both protecting sites and also bringing that type of knowledge as we go forward. So thank you both.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. I'm really excited to tap into your knowledge as we talk about this stuff. Okay. So I guess one of the things that really got me thinking when we started this conversation was just how many of the archaeological and historical sites that we come across in our work that have all these myths and legends and stories attached to them. And, where do those come from? Are they true? Do they have any basis in fact? And why are there so many historic sites that kind of spark this, kind of mythology and...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, again, I think it was a delight when we've only, trust us listeners, we're going to sound like old friends here, but we really have only had one conversation prior just to kind of think things through and to see those intersections, build and to recognize how much, again, although I may come at it looking at different data, I mean, that we're kind of in that quest of that same question. And I think to get to your point is that kind of the human desire and the human need for storytelling, for making sense of the world. I think it's one of the things that draw people both to archaeology and to folklore studies proper, but of course is generating, again, and particularly when there are questions about structures or questions about, the potential meaningfulness of something that was once important to a group of people who are no longer here. I mean, that just leads to a beautiful speculation. It's very frustrating on one level, right? Because, the things the lore that people can conjure up to explain things can be,
Frustrating.
Yeah, to say it diplomatically, yes, frustrating. But the desire for explanation, right? I mean, it's just so deliciously human, and that's what I love about my job, and what I trust, you must love as archaeologists.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what drives, I think, most archaeologists is what happened. Well, we want the story.
Yeah.
That's what we're after.
Yeah. And I do, I love the idea that if we can't figure out the story from the factual point of view, people will often supply their own, or I mean, so often the stories that are being generated in folklore studies are those that are responding to cultural movements or cultural anxieties, cultural joys. I mean, all of the complexities of being human can get filtered into and shape how we tell those stories.
Yeah, like a lot of times too, doesn't fear drive stories to the need to explain a fear?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure, 100%, right? I mean, it's certainly here we think in New England. Think of probably what's the best known example in Connecticut of Nick Bellantoni and Mike Bell working together decades ago now to uncover what was happening in these graves. And of course, we tap into the New England vampire panic on account of that and begin to unpack that. And lo and behold, we're often truly a cultural phenomenon shaped by fear, both in the horrific response of the treatment of certain, bodies that were dead, not undead, but also responding to that type of frustration. It's one of the hardest things when I'm teaching, let's say, vampires to my students, is that, thankfully we have antibiotics and we have vaccines and we have all these things that really we can take for granted. So they're not seeing the commonality of a young person cut down in the prime of their life, where just 100, 120 years ago, it wasn't. I couldn't judge if it were commonplace, but it wasn't uncommon. And they're how we deal with that type of fear.
Yeah, and just to kind of circle back on that, we did a show with Nick Bellantoni 2 Octobers ago, I believe, where we discussed the discovery that Stephen's talking about, the New England vampires, where they actually uncovered a body that had been altered after death to prevent it from getting up and walking. And this is tied to a fear of consumption, to tuberculosis, which was a wasting disease. And so people had this fear that their loved ones were basically getting up and coming and draining their life force away, as other members of the family would get sick. So a way to put a stop to it was to make sure they couldn't get up and do that.
Right, and it's very gruesome. Rearrangements of the bones of the deceased, but also we know of ritual practices in which the heart would have been removed from the corpse itself, frequently burned. Sometimes, if the accounts are to be taken for as statements of veracity, the rituals to protect those from their deceased sometimes involved breathing in the smoke of a loved one's burning heart, sometimes consuming it in various ways. Again, from our perception of this now, truly horrifying. And yet we think, again, in Rhode Island, we're talking 1890s. We're talking 1890s. It's not that long ago. That's not that long ago. That is...
But in this instance, because Sarah opened talking about the intersection of your respective pursuits, which came first? The folklore came first there, yes? Before people started finding these distorted corpses and rearranged bones, correct?
I think people were aware of the practice before the actual individual that had this done to them turned up archaeologically. Then that body of work was there to draw on to help interpret that burial when Nick came across it.
Got it.
But it's a great question in that way, right? Very often we're finding that there's a lore preserved only in an oral tradition or a written tradition in some form that is a kind of a record of a cultural phenomenon, but we don't have any evidence of it actually occurring until archaeologists can give us that data or give us, there might be hints of it, there might be, and then the question is always, how much do you believe, right? When people may make statements about certain practices of the past that are either passed on through an oral tradition or passed on, again, written, but a good folklorist skeptic may want, pun intended, may want a body, and and so one must cautiously believe stories that are passed on. And again, I think that's why it's so helpful and essential when archaeologists can provide testimony to it and clarify, of course, some of the more fantastical elements that come out of that.
Yeah. And I think that, this is a good kind of case study for thinking about the ways that maybe stories develop. Well, this is more of your wheelhouse than mine, but I'm just thinking that, the disease of consumption, tuberculosis, was still mysterious at this time period, right? We didn't have the medical knowledge that we have now, and people were trying to find a way to explain it and a way to address it. And I think that a lot of the more recent stories that are associated with historic sites and things like that also come out of that even modern desire to explain the things that we don't get, because we're a little bit disconnected even from our very recent history.
Yeah, very much so. Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, it's one of those things where you could show like just tools that were, just think about it, like tools that were useful and well known and common a couple of decades ago look like they are visitors, were brought from visitors from from another world, and because of that the technological changes that have made for a certain disconnect from there. So I 100% agree with you that kind of and the lacuna of that understanding is often again so often filled by storytelling or those types of speculations that end up fueling narratives. So, I'm kind of curious here, Sarah, too. I mean, not that and the last thing I would want to do is add another thing that you have to do in your job, but how often are you kind of asked to explain something that might be a relatively common historical feature, but that people have just lost their the connection to or understanding of?
Yeah, I think all the time would be a good answer for that, because if you think about it, our landscape is so different than it was even 100 or 150 years ago, right?
Sure.
And a lot of the very mysterious places that we have in our people are like, I found this pile of stones in the middle of nowhere,
right? In
the middle of the woods. There's, what could it possibly be? But 150 years ago, there was like a whole community there that's not there anymore, right? And it was cleared, and there were fields and sheep and industry, and now it's just the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I live in Lyme, and I brought my son, we were bringing a friend home. We went back on one of the back roads where several of the 120 years ago, several of the Lyme Impressionist artists lived, and I mentioned that they would sometimes paint from the height of their house, and they paint the Connecticut River. And my son said, "How's that even possible?"
Can't see it.
Because you can't see it. And I said, well, let's be scientists. Let's figure this out. And sure enough, he begins to speculate, and he says, wait a minute, were the trees not here? I'm like, ding, 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 right, that this was basically all pasture land. But now it looks like these trees have been here forever if you're not a botanist, or you're not somebody at least with some familiarity of new growth from there. And so, yeah, as you say this, I'm smiling, imagining how often the answer is just a little bit back in time. This was different, right? Yeah. And not to put you on the spot too, but do you get the again? Like I'm thinking of some of the the airline trail now is becoming a great. Forgive me for doing a little bit of promotion of Eastern Connecticut, but it's a great place for a hike. But just off one of the paths up there by Thompson, right, are some of those chambers. And wild speculation about who made them, what they are, what they're doing. In particular, as more and more tourists begin to encounter them, whips up the mystery. Here, I beg, to wonder, is that something that you're often having to answer? What are these chambers? Why are they here? Who made them? How is it true the Phoenicians made them?
Yeah, well, definitely. That's one of the things that does spark people's imagination, because they look so different. A cellar hole, you can relate to a cellar hole pretty easily, right? Or a stone wall, something like that. But some of the other types of structures that people used are less relatable, less common, less easily identifiable. And people have, and the interpretations of these things have really changed a lot over time. And the stories that people have attached to them have changed over time, right? So I think that we've been interested in them for a long time, and there was a huge uptick in questions and interest in this stuff during COVID, during the pandemic.
Oh, of course,
because people
sure.
were home and they were out walking in the woods and they were seeing things they never saw before, right?
Sure, right.
It just sparked a lot of interest and a lot of questions and a lot more people getting involved and, being like, there's all this historic stuff and you have to come and make sure that it's safe. And, it's great because it's really increased, I think, people's protective, stewardship kind of impulses about the places where they live. But there's also that mystery, like, I don't know what this is in the woods.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And Blair Witch Project doesn't help, right? When you get the kind of popular culture making those things, we laugh, and yet, part of my gig involves often wrestling with people who, literally speculate that there are conduits to other worlds and chambers that open up. And, again, I on the one level, they keep me in business. On the other level, well, I could face I wouldn't mind retirement if it meant an end to some of the.
Well, several of the sites I had on my list, actually, some people have speculated about entrances to other worlds, dimensions, portals. That comes up a lot.
Yeah,
it's a pretty common theme. And where do you think that comes from?
When you look at the lore of it, for me, if it's in New England, my first question would be, how old can we find the reference to these kinds of stories? And by which I mean is, are they coming with immigrant populations, right? So this is purely speculative, but if someone were to say to me that, we're hearing stories that there's a chamber or something akin to a chamber, and it's, is it, even as I know it sounds a little odd to say, but is this potentially a chamber of another world? Where I would go is to the comparative folklore studies and wonder, was there, for example, an Irish or Scottish population that moved in the area, given that there are these, again, stories of the Shia place. We're coming up on Halloween, one of the evenings, Samhain, right? One of the evenings when the doors of the other world supposedly open. So if you have immigrant populations bringing these types of traditions, sometimes they anchor in a community and need to be placed somewhere. And so you can see that become a part of it. If there isn't a kind of a historical trajectory that might suggest whoever arrived here or came here brought stories and then reapplied them, then I usually do is this a post 60s counterculture kind of supernatural, the explosion of supernatural media and the popularization of it from the 60s or late 60s on. And again, like I'm at 52, I was embarrassed to love horror as a kid because I knew it was something you weren't really supposed to love. And now it's, if I teach a horror studies class at UMass, I hundreds of students will take it. Nobody's embarrassed by loving the supernatural and the weird and the horrific. And then that's happened since it became popular. And so that's also, popular culture has generated just crazy ideas to keep people guessing and going. I'm obviously far more satisfied when I can locate it a little bit earlier. This might have been an immigrant story that got brought and attached, and it was similar kinds of structures or some ideas, and they put out. It's not. Just to be clear about this, under no circumstance is it actually an opening to another dimension, right? But sometimes that lore can be genuinely have an antiquity to it that is hundreds and hundreds of years old, but just brought over. Witchcraft beliefs, for example, right? Some of the sites that might be associated with that, also some of the sites that aren't associated with it, but then have that thrust upon them from there. So that movement of people, which again, I think is why the archaeology is so important to understand, that to track the movement of people and therefore the movement and adaptation of their stories.
And when all else fails, blame tourism. Right?
Yeah. Well, it often is, right? It's often a good,
I just started to jump in because I know Sarah has a long list, but how does this fantastical, you did even one that just blew me away way, in your series on our air about the often forgotten vagabond era, and it was the Leatherman, and it took on a Frankenstein-esque kind of a twist. Now, can you remind our listeners and our roundtable how that came to be?
Well, I mean, delightfully, there's one of the stories of the Leatherman. I mean, I kind of trust that a lot of listeners to the Archaeology of Connecticut probably know, if not have a fondness for our one of our resident vagabonds, the Leatherman. Again, as we were talking off air, and as I've done in a series, he inherited a number of stories that were put upon an earlier vagabond, the Darned Man. But then there was often wild speculation, and one of the stories before people settled on Jules Bourglet as the name and that story, there were competing stories of the Leatherman, one of which, believe this or not, involved a subterranean chamber of a man trying to revive the corpse of his dead lover. And that's who the Leatherman was, and when you kind of, I mean, the Frankenstein reference is when you kind of map it out as to when people would have had both exposure to Mary Shelley's work, but that theme of the reanimated lover, the theme of the reanimated corpse, and also questions about the advent of electricity and the kind of all of the changing science spurred this attempt to kind of dignify the Leatherman as this figure, and there just wasn't any uptake to it. I mean, this was a story that was competing with numerous other ones, and there just wasn't uptake because people couldn't go with it, and stuck with some others from there. But the stories that die out are often, or that are competing with others, are often where the real meat is, in that sense. Now, had they only found, let's think of it this way, had they found, rather than Leatherman, simply the caves that we have potentially associated with them, had they found anything approximating a building or a chain or something else, there might have been some legs to that story, and it could have echoed in a way that you just couldn't when it was too much into the realm of the fantastical and the fictional. So I love it though. So hey, can I, speaking of which, because I've been dying to ask you this question. So our friend the Darned Man, who was the vagabond that traversed the kind of northeastern part of the state and died in the 1860s, and again was really the inventor. No, he wasn't the inventor, but the original kind of stories of the man who's wandering because he's lost his love. Well, we are, according to every historical document, he died in Stirling and was buried in that the Oneko. It's Oneko Oweko. I think it's Oneko. Oneko, right? That there's a cemetery out there, kind of in the middle of nowhere, because Stirling itself is kind of out in the middle of nowhere. But he's been dead since 1863. Presumably, I mean, was placed in an unmarked grave. Is there any way, from an archaeological perspective, that one could find the body? So if there were an attempt to put a gravestone for him, I mean, again, assuming that everything now would have deteriorated, that was, I wouldn't be wrong.
It depends on the local conditions, but
gotcha.
There's a good chance that a lot of him probably would have deteriorated by now.
Gotcha. And I mean, is there any process to find, I guess what I'm saying is, how do you find somebody buried in an unmarked grave? Is that Well,
I mean, it's tricky depending on how many other unmarked graves there might be in a particular cemetery, or if, people might have a rough idea from any kind of documentation, but ground penetrating radar can at least be used to say there are likely graves in this area. But lots of times in cemeteries, there's a whole area of unmarked graves where paupers and other people were buried. So it could be tricky to pinpoint a particular
Yeah.
But you might be able to get the area and say, this is it.
This would be it from there. Yeah. So not impossible this far. That far along. Not easy to do, but not.
Yeah. I mean, we use GPR all the time to find unmarked graves. So
yeah,
the technology is definitely there. And then, you can either go with the data that you get from the ground penetrating radar, which is basically picking up on the cut into the soil where the soil is taken out and put back in and then looks different than the surrounding matrix.
I see. Yep.
But then you could always, kind of scrape the top off and see if you actually see the outline of a grave shaft.
Right.
And you could do that without actually, getting in there and interfering with anybody.
Just kind of running with this, right? So if someone were presumably a pauper buried in the 1860s, I assume you'd have to know things like, again, I'm purely speculating, but would that be a casket burial? Would there be, would you look for, if you wanted, again, just speculating, but if you wanted to find the remains of a poor person, would there be things that you would be, kind of looking for versus someone else maybe buried in this manner, or if there were coffins, it would be made of this type of material rather than that type of material?
I mean, I would guess if it was a pauper or, a kind of an unhomed person, then it would probably be either a wooden casket or no casket,
or none.
Maybe a shroud of some kind. You're getting into that period in the 19th century when burial traditions are getting more elaborate and coffins are getting more elaborate. But again, that comes more with money than,
Right, yeah.
So they do get easier to find in that time period because there oftentimes is a more solid box that's still down there, and you can pick up.
Gotcha.
But I don't know that somebody who didn't have any money would have that, unless someone decided to do it for them.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, that's so cool to me that again, those are the kinds of things that you have to bring in.
But did he have a fan base when he passed?
No,
speak of?
There is.
Speaking of friends as a support group.
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, we have the name of the person who found him dead and who presumably buried him. But so I guess we could go dig into some family records there to see if there's any idea that they gave him a good Christian burial or something like that. But no, I mean, as a figure, he was, and I think also that I'd have to. I mean, to me, you'd want to speculate, or you'd want to find out what. Again, I presume Sterling in the 1860s is pretty much a farming community, right? I'm not aware, although they did have, there was a chamber out there, right? I think it was a devil's chamber that was, I thought, out in that area, that was removed. I want to say, I might be getting this wrong. I thought there was one out there removed for some purpose, but a very cold chamber. So okay, I'm going off the lines here, but my point being is that if there was activity, if there were wealthier people in the area, I guess that's something that we could find to see if there might have been people who stepped up to take care of him in that way. Yeah. This is why I love these kinds of conversations where things, I mean, literally I've never thought about before, but you're able to run with an expert on to think about. Oh yeah, okay, So now I can obsess about different shapes of coffins.
I'll give you all kinds of things to obsess
Love it.
So I know you kind of opened the door earlier with a discussion of, the counterculture and the supernatural and all of that. But I'm just, really fascinated by all of so many of the sites that we deal with, and some of the ones we've talked about on this program, the Lost Village or Barrahack, Old Newgate Prison, Gay City. So many sites have these ghost stories attached to them, and apart from just the cultural trends leading towards more, mainstreaming, I guess, of the supernatural and horror and things like that, what are the roots of some of these stories? Is it just kind of is it a romanticized sort of sadness for the past, or where does this come from?
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that, obviously each place will have a different kind of history and a texture to it. To me, there really is a question if if the stories, if you can't get those stories, or you can't get the history back from beyond the 1960s, my general rule of thumb is this is probably, and I mean this in all seriousness, it's probably bored teenagers looking to legend trip, looking to have something to do, right? And so Gay City, I think, is a good example there, is although some of the stories, there's a dispatched peddler story there that is almost a perfect echo of the Micah Rood story of out in Franklin of the bloody apples, and so in that case, you could almost map where stories, if there's an area, say like Franklin, right, where the story is essential and old, and then you get not exactly the same, but a similar idea, similar motif, similar narrative structure out in, say, Hebron, where Gay City is. That's not too far. You can see that somebody was transmitting this story. Maud's grave, right? Actually,
all in town, yeah.
Exactly. But that story of witchcraft actually echoes stories that stretch into Western Rhode Island. So you can almost put on a map of where there's a general theme, and that's clearly, right, people telling stories, and then shifting the location of where this thing happened, shifting the location of where that happened. That's a constant in folklore studies, right? Of kind of doing those maps. If you can't get back before, though, if you can't find storytellers, if you can't find examples, again, generally before the 1960s, it's likely, rule of thumb, the place is probably going to be out from the center of town. That is a place where there can be drinking and drugs, right? It's a place where kids will often, younger people will go. It's a place where they can often, what we call legend trip, right? Where they're able to kind of test their mettle by going out there, by being a part of the story, right? And it's a place where, frequently they need a good story for a reason to go. And I don't dispute the integrity of those. I think they're wonderful. I mean, again, there's the vibrancy of the tales. We'll see if we come back in 25 years, there'll be new sites of kind of, nothing happened here, but man, now it's haunted by, the most diabolical figures because, bored kids need something to do. Those, in some cases, those other times, though, I mean, those stories will echo because they were essential events in a community, and people didn't lose the history of them. So we pretty much know where the Micah Rood farm is in Franklin, but there are rival places for it. And those rival places have never been able to push out the story and reclaim that space, because again, although this is something that was happened 300 years ago, it still was an anchoring feature in the community, and people passed it on for so long from there. So I'm not quite answering the question, because it really depends on the type of lore, the type of story that you're dealing with, and how. Again, even going back to your point, Dave, and sometimes tourism, and sometimes, a place that is condemned becomes a site for visitations. We'll see that down with the Seaside Sanatorium down in Waterford, right? I mean, there's no ghost stories there yet. There inevitably will be once they do.
No, I was looking online today, and I came across a few.
Oh, you found some already?
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Oh, I'm delighted. They've started. That's right.
I think, that's the whole ghost story thing is really interesting to me because, as archaeologists, right, like, as I said before, we're trying to get the story, and in our version of truth, I guess, based on the historical and archaeological data, the physical things we can see and find and learn about the past. But that's one of those things. It doesn't matter if you go to Gay City and do an archaeological excavation and you just find, houses and the stuff that people had in their houses and a mill and all this stuff. That's not going to change one way or another, whether or not people believe that it's haunted.
Yeah.
There's not much we can do about that. We can address, sometimes who built this. Was it Celtic monks or colonial farmers? But we can't deal with the ghost thing.
Yeah,
archaeologically, it's kind of outside of our.
Yeah, and again, it's again the beauty of the ghost story. Again, I mean, I love them I love them even as they frustrate me, right? I mean, as it's one of the things that I did a lecture just last week in my classes, and basically told I disappointed up 200 kids in my class because I told them I don't believe in ghosts, and they want me to, and part of it's because they do, and even when I explained some unusual experiences I've had, and then attributed it to my brain making gaps of judgment or the biochemical reasonings, it's not satisfying. That, I mean, we're never going to get rid of the ghost story, and in fact, I have you faced this, because there are increasingly, it's not rampant yet, but there are increasingly I'm seeing often tales of the archaeologist who knows the truth but is hiding it, right? And
that's a common theme these days.
The conspiratorial, that this was an alien landing, or that this is a place where ghosts exist, and the shadowy government or the Illuminati or somebody are paying off archaeology. As again, you'd be very, very wealthy if you were making the money you're accused of making from the Illuminati.
We did a show with Ken Fader and Bill Farley on Graham Hancock, right?
Yeah.
And his new Netflix show, and that theme runs through his whole thing. The mainstream archaeologists don't want you to know this, and we covered that aspect of it as well. And it's like, but people do, and it. Obviously, there's a lot of emotion attached to these things when people really believe in the supernatural aspects of them. So sometimes I do get calls where people are like, I went out to such and such a place and I had this experience, and I know that someone was murdered and buried there, and you have to go look.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm, and it's like...
Yeah. Well, anytime anyone brings up there was a murder there, I assume you have to consider, am I calling 911? Is this a confession? I'm not the right
person to call for that. But I mean, I just think that, but the strength of feeling is like, I just have to tell somebody, and I'm going to. Yeah. I found your number online, and I'm going to tell you. Yeah. But I think that is a really interesting aspect of it, because there's just nothing we can do archaeologically to deal with the ghost thing. So.
Yeah. Now, are there occasions when you might find, if you were to find something, I guess what I'm asking at is, have you come across, I mean, we have the vampire idea, right? I mean, that's a kind of solid one. There is evidence of a belief in witchcraft. So again, to be clear about this, we're saying belief in vampires, belief in witchcraft. I haven't thought about this. Do you come across archaeological data that might be belief in ghosts? So somebody's expression of belief in ghosts from the 1800s, 1900s. And again, literally as I'm saying this, I can think of narratives from the 1800s, 1700s around the area where people clearly believe in ghosts.
Oh, yeah. And I think that, it's not just, it's beliefs in the supernatural as well as beliefs in, different other types of cultural things, like things that you do for protection and things like that. Like I have not personally found, but archaeologists have found witch bottles, for instance, right, in old houses. They found shoes in the walls. They found interesting things in people's burials above and beyond the vampire situation. So, I mean, there are physical reflections of those belief systems definitely in the archaeological record, and that's pretty common, I think.
And if you came across something, I mean, it's a hypothetical, but if you came across something unusual, like that, I mean, again, I'm just speculating here, but something that, could you make a judgment call that this seems to be something that has a ritual purpose that we just don't understand, or and that kind? And again, it may turn out to be somebody's failed attempt at a new tool or something or other. But
yeah, and I think like in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, that's like it's kind of a joke. It's like the archaeologist cop out, like, oh, I don't understand it. It must be ritual or ceremony.
Oh, really? That's great.
So that's kind of a thing that happens a lot, I think. But we do find things all the time that we don't understand, and that requires digging a little bit deeper into a society and a belief system, if it's more recent, into the documents to try to get a sense of that, which is one of the parts that I find the most interesting. Yeah. Because then you can get at things that aren't just so easily understandable.
Yeah.
Well, you told our listeners that there was a time, very short period of time, that the sea serpent actually had been given a scientific name.
It's exactly true. Yeah, I won't remember the name to pull it up immediately, but the belief in the great, what we now call kind of the Great New England Sea Serpent, which marched, you can trace it from its earliest vibrant stories up in the Gulf of Maine in the 1700s, often because people are leaving Cape Ann to go whaling, to go fishing, or to otherwise be in a maritime environment and then not return. And so again, that European monster that is a sea serpent, right, is kind of remapped onto a New England experience. Then over time, we literally can see the stories march down the coastline, and they're here in Long Island Sound by the 1800s, coinciding with tourism, right? I mean, and so if in the late 1870s, 1880s, here, right, not too far, well, not here, but not too far from here, say in Old Saybrook or the areas, hotels would advertise usually in newspapers in April or May, we've just seen the sea serpent, we're the best place to come and visit. But there was a genuine belief that these things might be real, and a scientific organization thought that they had discovered one in the early 1800s. They thought they had discovered a small one. It's young. Numerous people documented, and it turned out to be a black snake. I forget it was a black snake with cancer sores, distorted, but it was given a name of as kind of proof from there. And so that shifting tension between, again, they're kind of laughed at now for their enthusiasm to make this be a scientific creature, and yet I have a lot of sympathy because at least they were trying to do something scientific, right?
Explain what they found.
Right. And they abandoned it. I mean, that's the other thing too, is they abandoned, when proven wrong, they didn't double down and say, no, this is really, a young sea serpent. They did, ultimately, abandon that idea. That must be, again, a thorn in the side, right? I mean, so often we see that in folklore studies, where once the belief is established, it's not going to change. I mean, there's no amount of evidence that you can provide that just the story is going to supersede the facts. Stories almost always do, but the tenacity of belief when somebody just will not change. And I think, not to be on a kind of dour note, but I think to me that's one of the real questions of, I love being proven wrong when my original thoughts turn out to be in error, because that's what I'm trained to do. And I have to imagine, again, for any good scientist, it's a similar approach. Yeah. But that's not the mainstream that we often have to deal with.
No, and I think lots of times if you do change your interpretation over time with the input of new evidence, that's considered kind of like waffling, or these scientists don't know what they're doing anyways. It's a dangerous game.
Right. Yeah. It's so crazy, right? I mean, because...
But, and you see this archaeologically, right? Like, I think one of the things that, we had on our list of possible things to talk about was the Celtic Viking connection to this region, and how people are determined to find those sites, and some people are determined that they have found those sites, and they've gone out and they've done their research and they've found what they consider to be strong physical evidence of a Viking presence or a Celtic presence on the landscape. And then lots of times other people don't see the same evidence when they go out and look at it as well, but that belief is so strong. I'm thinking about if you're familiar with, it's not Connecticut, but the Fallons Pond area on Cape Cod.
Oh, Cape Cod, yeah. So, yeah.
Long-term research program there. All the streets around there have names, Viking-related names, because that was it. That was the spot.
Do you know, because I don't, do you know when so much of the Viking push in New England was after, it was in the mid 1800s with the proposal that the Newport Tower was a Viking tower. and it just kind of caught on like wildfire. I think was it Wadsworth? Who someone writes The Skeleton in Armor, right?
Yes.
And so we get an actual discovery, but then is poetically turned into this kind of thing. The other thing that was going on at the same time, because I'm thinking of I'm blanking on the guy in Rhode Island, but it was also some of the earliest Atlantis stories, that were coming through. So Vikings, Atlantis, Celts explodes mid 1800s in the lore, and continues. In fact, there's even a story that explains the rumblings at Macamudus as a. I'm almost embarrassed to say this one, because it is truly problematic. But the idea was that in the story, it's published by a white person, that tells the story of the bravest of the indigenous people is a chieftain by the name of Mudus, who is called upon by the Narragansett to repel the Vikings in the 800s. And Mudus does so, but is slain in the process, and his dying wish is to be buried in Mount Tom with the promise that he will forever rumble, right, to keep the Vikings away, right? I mean, it's just an outlandish fictional tale, and again, it never really developed into active lore, and I'm kind of glad, because there's a lot of problems with this one. But it is tangential to the rich lore of Macamudus, but it also speaks to how many people were just obsessed with the Viking fad in the 1800s, late 1800s, and then the Atlantis fad, and then the Celtic fad, and very often those things kind of merge together, right?
And I think that, a lot of, Ken Feder's talked about this and some other folks too, but a lot of this stuff is coming out of this anxiety about immigration and things like that, right? And it's a connection, a deeper, longer connection to a purer, whiter Europe, I think. Right? I think that's where a lot of these stories are coming out of and building during this time period, which is really interesting, for the cultural reflections, but also for the implications that they have for people's actual lived experience in these time periods. Yeah.
So, we'll see it sometimes as again, I know, I can't remember exact place, but I know that the fact that there are grapes on the Connecticut flag, and the fact that, and those I assume are Vitis vinifera, I assume that they were brought from Europe, right? But the fact that we do have indigenous grapes, Vitis riparia, that of course that's, again, I know I've come across people who have speculated that the Vinland that was named was not, further north, but that ergo it must be that they made it down here to Connecticut. And, where do you start? Right?
There's a lot of, and I think that's the same. I think Vinland was also supposed to be that Fallon's Pond area on Cape Cod. That's
right.
Also part of that story.
Yeah. Is that one where, again, there's one where one of the brothers of Leif Erikson, that might be closer to Plymouth, but he purportedly dies and is buried.
I don't think it's there, but I know what you mean.
I got to dig into this, because there's a buried Viking brother, right? And again, and as you're saying, that then this leads to all kinds of strange land claims and alternative histories. And again, I entirely get what when you have a massive influx of the Irish coming to the area, I can understand where there would be a kind of national ethnic pride in making the claim that St. Brendan the Navigator made it over here, right? And to read the narrative of St. Brendan as a kind of mapping out of, that whale that they landed on wasn't really a whale, it must have been such and such. I get that impulse, but yeah, I also would like to correct that impulse. And oh wow, I can't imagine. You must be though at a loss sometimes, right? When you must know at occasions as an archaeologist that just doesn't fit the pattern, but you don't have the data. Right. That must be one of the most frustrating things.
Yeah,
right?
and I think with some of these things, you can look at a site where people claim that there was a Viking settlement, and say there's no physical evidence of a Viking settlement at this site, right?
Yeah.
Because there is at Lonsdale Meadow up in Newfoundland. Yes, I think so. I mean, they actually found it, right? They have the houses footings and they have the fires and all that stuff. We don't have it.
Yeah.
And no matter how hard people have looked, we can't find it because it isn't there.
Right.
And that is kind of the struggle where, I think that people are so sure sometimes that these things are true that either like we don't know it when we see it or we're hiding it or, that's kind of the frustrating aspect of that. And,
yeah, you have got to argue. I mean, we're teaching people, right, that the lack of evidence, right, doesn't necessarily mean, it's kind of, But
what archaeologist wouldn't want to find a new Viking settlement in New England? That would be a beer maker, right? Exactly. Amazing.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Do you get? I'm also curious, like with the kind of the carvings and markings things, where again in folklore, the folklore goes wild. I mean, it is deliciously off the charts sometimes as to what people will speculate. Yeah. This is a type of writing, or what this is, or that's. I kind of joked about Phoenicians earlier because of Dighton Rock in Rhode Island, right? Yep. As a place. But what seemed to me to be relatively easily explained iconographic carvings of just maybe pre-colonial. It's not. It doesn't strike me as a technology impossibility, but man, does that? Have you seen? Have you been asked those kinds of questions?
Yeah, and I think lots of times too, people are coming across marks on rocks that they believe are petroglyphs or important markings that are really just natural too.
Oh.
And it's trying to get people to grasp the geological aspects of how these rock formations happen, right? Because we live in a post-glacial landscape. We've got rocks everywhere.
Right.
The glaciers did stuff to the rocks.
Right.
They put them places where they don't look like they belong.
Right, yeah.
And I had arguments with people, saying that native people took this giant stone and pushed it up this hill and put it at the top.
Oh, wow.
But why?
Yeah, what? Yeah.
That's a really important question, I think.
Ritual.
Yeah, exactly.
Anybody
free weekend and a ritual, right? Exactly.
And not to discount, and I would say that a lot of the stories that are coming, and I want to be clear about this, is it's a different situation when Indigenous people are coming to you and telling you things about the landscape and their oral traditions and their stories,
right,
than when people who are just walking through the woods are finding them and then imprinting those stories on them themselves.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a...
Yeah, but let's pick up on something like that, because I know, for example, there are, occasions like when Boy Scout camps and they have claimed, rock formations or places as their kind of... And in some ways, they do have a technical land claim because it might be a camp that's been in existence for 100 years or something like that. But then if there's a counterclaim that this was a sacred site by Indigenous people, right? Does the state archaeologists have to? I mean, you can come in and weigh in on those kinds of things, right? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think and we do now. We've developed a process for recording stone sites of importance.
Yep.
Within the state, kind of in the same thing as we record archaeological sites and historic structures. But it's really important to have those Indigenous voices in that discussion, because I think that what we don't really want is a lot of people speaking for Indigenous people, and that's happened for long enough in archaeology. And I think, we try to take a much different approach to that now and try to have as much of a consultation and discussion on the table about things like that. But when those sites are identified, they are definitely, try to protect them as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious too about the Friends. I mean, how... are you often negotiating these kinds of questions? I mean, as folks who are directly and frequently dealing with the public and trying to build support, you must also open yourself up to some fascinating.
Yeah, well,
thank you for not making me finish that question.
Our membership is varied, as you may guess. We have archaeologists as members, and we have a lot of people who are hobbyists or avocational. So a lot of times we just, filter the questions over to Sarah because we don't want to screw up the answers.
Yeah.
But the people who are, archaeologists in the know, they will address questions by the public. We'll be for example, at a dig, or a lot of times we have outreach programs where we have school children come, or historical societies, and that's a really good point for a lot of questions to come up, and we address the ones we can, and the others we say, ask Sarah.
That's great.
It's too bad that Scott's not here tonight, because he is a dedicated watcher of shows like Oak Island and things like that. And I think
he's a better man than I.
Right, but he loves to get into it with people about these shows, and so sometimes I'm like, talk to Scott.
How I'm particularly to think of the kids. How often? I mean, I would, I must confess that dinosaurs led me to archaeology, that led me to, on another path. So, how often are you getting the non-human civilizations questions thrown your way for a paleontology or?
I mean, kids are usually pretty willing to accept like what you tell them about, archaeological materials. It's more adults, because they have firmer ideas in their mind, I think, about what things are that are more difficult sometimes to convince.
I love that. Yeah. So
kids are pretty open. They're open to just learning new stuff. So
so they'll accept it's a woolly mammoth bone and not a giant that we once roamed.
I mean, they might come up with that first, or they might say it's a T-Rex first.
I love it.
Mammoths are cool too, right?
They always have their ideas. When we have a field school, they'll look at, say, is this anything? Is this something? Or it looks like something. But when you tell them it's not, it's like, okay.
We've actually run out of time.
Oh, you're kidding me.
So
we just started.
We probably need to revisit this at some later date.
We had a list, Dave. We had a list.
Right.
We didn't even get to the
actually
list.
on our list.
Have to come back.
Future show. But I think we did demonstrate that there's a pretty strong intersection between these
I'm
fields,
thrilled and excited. Again, I love, to me, folklore studies, we folklorists too often operate in the vacuum of talking to other folklorists, and therefore, it's not that we're unaware of the data, but we're not looking at that. So, I mean, to me, this is just such a pleasure. Thank you again for having me on, and I hope I can come back.
Thanks for coming. We'd love to have you back.
We could talk about all kinds of strange and awesome places.
How can people find you?
Best way right now is to get to a Google machine and type in Stephen Gencarella, UMass, and my faculty page will pop up.
Perfect. And Glenda?
Yeah, you can find us FOSA at fosa-ct.org. There's a lot of cool stuff out there. Check us out.
Yep, and it's osa.uconn.edu, or you can follow us on Facebook.
Hey, guys, thanks so much.
Thank you. Are you kidding?
Can't wait for episode number 2.
Right.